Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's food safety webinar, Wildlife, Domesticated Animals, and Land Use. This webinar will identify the basic effects wildlife and your own domesticated animals can have on your operation and how your operation can implement basic practices to mitigate against the food safety risks animals may cause. We will also discuss management, monitoring, and corrective actions to mitigate possible food pathogen contamination when you identify signs of animal intrusion. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Attendees will learn about produce safety, foodborne pathogens, worker health, wildlife, land use, post-harvest handling, and legal issues associated with food safety in Indian country. This series is part of a twofold effort to reach producers and food businesses. The IFAI has also launched a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety for a listing of these trainings and information about how to register. The in-person training events will result in the award of a certificate. The webinars we are hosting will help you better understand these issues and will help prepare you to participate more deeply in the regional training events. We will not award a certificate for the webinar trainings. We're merely trying to broaden knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the regional training events. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll find the slideshow being presented today. I invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety, where you will find more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars. The issues we will cover in business practices, microbiology, and legal issues are additional information our experts believe is important to have access to as a grower. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenter, Poppy Davis, will take questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can either use the control panel to raise their hand or submit a question by using the questions feature of the control panel. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Our work is part of the broad efforts we will undertake to provide outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Poppy Davis, our Director of Entrepreneurship. Poppy teaches and advises on business and policy issues affecting family-scale farms and ranches and related associations. She is the Director of Entrepreneurship at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas School of Law and consults for farm programs across the country. Previously, she was the National Program Leader for Small Farms and Beginning Farmers and Ranchers at the USDA, and prior to that, a California Certified Public Accountant. She holds a Juris Doctor from Drake University Law School, a Master's in Journalism from Georgetown, and a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Economics from the University of California, Davis. With that, Poppy, I will hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this seminar. This is a particularly interesting one of these produce safety trainings because it deals with wildlife, domesticated animals, and land use, the interface on the farms. Brian, my screen's not advancing. Thank you. So
Poppy,
animals are, yes?
There may just be a little bit of a delay.
Thank you. Animals are a produce safety concern because they can carry human pathogens. So particularly, we're talking about E. coli, which many of you have probably heard about in the news when it's associated with food safety outbreaks. The other pathogens of major concern are Salmonella and Listeria. Those are both also things that you may have heard about on the news associated with food safety outbreaks. So animals can spread these human pathogens by depositing their feces in the field and spreading fecal contamination as they move. Animals, of course, are difficult to control. That's their nature, to move around and travel unnoticed. Even with fencing, as any farmer knows, animals still can come into the field. It's not possible to completely exclude them. And the first thing we want to say about this training is that's not what the rule requires. This rule is about reasonable steps that you would take to know when the animals are coming into the field and take reasonable steps to ensure that no food that you plan to harvest is contaminated. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my delay on my screen here. This is a diagram of how you might go about analyzing your farm to think about where the contamination might come from. One of the things we know for sure is that feces associated with animals in close contact with humans, so that would be a confined animal feeding operation. It would also be domestic animals or wild animals that are hanging out at a local garbage dump or just going through local trash and then going into the farm. Those are more likely to be infected with the pathogens that we're trying to avoid. So one of the first things that you want to do on your farm is just take a look at where the animals are likely to come from, what kinds of animals you're managing for, if they're domesticated animals or wild animals, and have a plan for how you're going to address them. It doesn't mean full exclusion. Wildlife can be a natural and valuable part of the landscape. Depending on the species, you may have endangered species issues, and you certainly don't want to do anything to interfere with those other laws. And there's nothing in the produce safety rule that requires you to be in conflict with the laws that protect endangered species. What you are required to do is be aware of these animals coming onto your farm. And if you observe any instance where they may have contaminated the food or where it's likely that they contaminated the food, then it's up to you not to harvest that food. So the kind of wildlife we're talking about may be wildlife that lives there all the time. It may just be wildlife that's passing through. Again, the ones of highest concern are the ones that are closest in association with human activities. So that would be animals that go through human trash and animals perhaps that are in confined feeding operations. So the rule, again, just requires you to assess the risk and to manage the harvest so that you don't harvest anything that's likely to have been contaminated. So first thing up, looking around, do you find any evidence of wildlife in your fields? Do you find any evidence that, say, a migrating flock of birds has gone through the field or a herd of deer has passed through? And then ask the question, how can you limit that contamination? This is about striking a balance. We already know that farmers do lots of things to keep wildlife out of their fields because wildlife eat the crop. So most of this isn't really new. This is putting these management practices in the context, the food safety context, as well as the context of losing some of the crop to animals eating it. So co-management is the term we use, and that talks about considering both food safety and conservation of natural resources and managing for both at the same time. Some of the conservation practices that encourage and support wildlife may increase wildlife activity near your fields. That doesn't have to decrease food safety. It just means that you have to manage for it as well as managing for your wildlife habitat. Some farms have stopped their conservation practices. That is not what's required by the law. Removing the conservation practices can damage the natural resources, and it doesn't necessarily increase food safety. The way to increase food safety and wildlife habitat is to have a plan that starts with reviewing the risks and benefits of the individual practices. The best example here is looking at the practice of having a bare ground buffer or having hedgerow vegetation. A bare ground buffer may discourage certain animals. It may encourage other animals. The hedgerow is the same way. It's going to create habitat to possibly bring more animals into proximity to your operation, but at the same time, it may keep them out of the field. So the point is that you have to have a plan that is unique for your situation and designed for your situation. The most important part of that plan is monitoring the wildlife activity. Most important thing, monitoring for feces and evidence of intrusion. Evaluating the risk of the contamination. If you see an animal just running through the field as fast as it can go, then you don't think that that's the same kind of risk as if you see a whole bunch of animals hanging out in the field for several hours, where you know that there's some risk that there's contamination of the crop after they were there for that long a period of time. It's also a matter of observing over time and thinking about what time of day they come through, what time of year they come through. The most critical part of your monitoring is immediately prior to harvest. That's when you want to go out, and this immediately prior to harvest means when you plan to harvest, sometime before you go and start harvesting, you go out and take a look around. That's monitoring. At that time, if you see any sign of animal intrusion, you want to take steps to assess the risk and decide if all or a portion of the crop can be safely harvested. Ways to deter wildlife, well-established, detours, netting. People joke that the swan here should be replaced with a gun. That's what lots of people use to get rid of the wildlife. There's air guns, noisemakers, bright balloons, things like that. Those are all deterrents. Again, you don't want to do things that are out of compliance with protections for wildlife, but you can co-manage to keep them healthy, but keep them out of your field. Wildlife and livestock interactions are another way that pathogens can be transferred. The pathogen loads in the domesticated animals may be impacted by animal management practices on the farm. And shared grazing lands and water sources may lead to cross-contamination between species. So in this picture, it's an encounter between a cow and a deer. The cow is actually the higher risk species because it's operating closer to humans. But when it interacts with the deer, that pathogen may be transferred, and then the deer's the one that's more likely to go tromping through your field because the cow's probably behind a fence, but the deer's going to jump over the fence and maybe get in your field. So domesticated animals such as livestock and pets may harbor human pathogens. Those are the ones of greatest concern. Domesticated animals are sometimes used in fields for a variety of reasons. That's okay. The rule does not prohibit that. What it does require is that you assess the risk of having that animal in the field. How long is it in the field? What's it doing there? How is it supervised? Is it likely at some point to contaminate what's in the field? Part of how you control domestic animals is thinking about simply when they're in the field. And if they're there working as working animals, deterring wildlife, or if they're really just there being mutts and hanging out at your feet and maybe getting into trouble. If they're there working, they're probably not there as long as if they're just hanging out with access to the field. Another thing to consider is if your workers are aware of cross-contamination on their shoes and equipment after they've been handling animals or animal feces and then going into the field. Another thing to consider is if you are doing production of produce on fields that were previously grazed. That's not against the rule. It just requires you to consider if manure is present on the ground and think about the time between when that manure was put on the ground and when the crop goes in and when the crop is handled or harvested. So before planting is the time to assess the overall risk of the field location. Think about the wind patterns. Wind can absolutely blow dried fecal matter from a grazing lot into a produce operation where it then gets wet from the irrigation and becomes an environment for bugs to grow. So wind patterns, water movement, the slope of the soil are all things to think about when you think about where you're going to plant in a way that's safe. Previous uses of that land, what was there before? That's going to affect what's in the soil and what the risks are when you plant there. Again, impact of any domesticated animals either on that field before you plant or adjacent to that field after you plant. Animal production, compost, and manure storage are all things that could, through wind and water, blow into the field where you're producing. And that's not exclusive. It could also be residential, commercial, or other land uses that create some sort of a risk hazard next to the field where you're planning to grow. And then we've talked already about assessing the wildlife risks. Do you know that that's a field that is right in the middle of a wildlife pathway and they're bound to come through it? Or do you know that the nature of that field is that the risk of wildlife passing through is actually quite low? For working animals, the best way to minimize risk is to not have them in the field when the edible portion of the crop is present. So using a horse to plant the field isn't going to be a problem at all because the edible portion of the crop has not even developed yet. But close to the harvest is when you want to have more concern. Ways to minimize the risk then would be to establish paths to minimize the contact between the animals and the growing areas, and to have standard operating procedures that outline practices to take if an animal defecates in the field near the produce. So an example of a standard operating procedure there would be if the animal has contaminated the produce, you should have some tape or some flags and just mark the spot off, and that's the spot that won't be harvested in the future. It doesn't contaminate the whole field, it just contaminates that little area. If you can get those little flags on wires and stick it in the field, then people know when they're coming through to harvest that that's an area not to harvest. Other standard operating procedures are standard operating procedures for animal and manure handling so that workers know how to be safe around that and not cross-contaminate between caring for the animal, cleaning up after the animal, and then going into the field. Pets, different from working animals, right? A lot of times on a farm, hard to tell the difference. The dog, the cat do have working functions, but they also maybe are pets. Visitors definitely should not have pets in the field. The pets that are working animals on the farm, we really just consider those working animals if they do have a job, but they're pets when they're sort of lounging around not doing their job. That's not a good time to have them in the field because they're not supervised at that time, and you can't necessarily observe if they've contaminated the produce. If they're there in the field with you, doing their job, probably to keep other animals out of the field, then it's less likely that they're going to contaminate the produce. Petting zoos, visitors, things like that, you definitely want to have signs and sinks available so that visitors understand that it's their responsibility not to carry any possible pathogens from the animals that they visit into the fields that they may visit. So we talked earlier about assessing the field before you plant in it. That's one critical time. The other critical time is to assess the field immediately prior to harvest. That doesn't mean while you are harvesting. It means immediately prior to harvest, going out and actually taking a look around and making sure that if anything is observed, anything obvious is observed that shows that animals have come through the field, that you take corrective action to ensure that that contaminated produce isn't harvested. So you can see evidence of straight up fecal contamination, and you might just see evidence of the animals passing through, trampling around. Maybe there's a fence where they've obviously gone through. We have some other sound on the line. We have other sound on the line.
Down here?
We have other people talking on the line.
What we do?
Yeah, Poppy, I think someone else joined who's on the presenter line, and he'll need to mute himself.
Thank you. So again, with a corrective action in a field, it doesn't necessarily mean the whole field is automatically unharvestable. It means that it's on you to assess what should not be harvested. And an example of a corrective action would be taking tape or flags and marking off the portion of the field that shouldn't be harvested before you have the workers go in and start harvesting. At that point, the harvest can proceed as long as the workers understand what areas they are not to harvest. So most obvious thing is don't harvest anything that may be contaminated. And then the second thing is to consider how much area around what's obviously contaminated is also likely to have been contaminated. So there isn't a hard and fast rule here, but there's a suggestion of a no harvest buffer zone that can vary anywhere from 0 to 25 feet, depending on the crop, climate, nature of the event, and how you're harvesting. So again, we can't give ever a one-size-fits-all neat and tidy specific thing for you to do. The point is that you have to be aware of your operation and what's reasonable for your operation. The point is just that you can't do nothing and not consider these things. Once they arise, you have a fair amount of latitude in how you yourself on your operation best address the issue. So you make your decision about what to do with the contamination. You can take it out of the field, but not take it for processing, not take it to be eaten fresh. You can leave it in the field unharvested. The important thing is that you want to have some documentation that you were thoughtful, you went out, you monitored, you saw what you saw, and you took corrective action that was appropriate to keep the harvest safe. The key thing that we've been leading up to is worker training. If your workers aren't aware of this, then they're not aware and they can't follow. So the critical thing is that the workers like yourself have to receive training. So you, the farmer, are going to go through these produce safety trainings and receive a certificate, but then your workers will also have to receive a training. They don't have to receive the same training and they don't have to receive the certificate, but they have to receive training to recognize and not harvest contaminated produce, to inspect and correct problems with harvest containers and equipment, and report issues to the supervisor so that they don't continue. So the workers have to understand the importance of a culture of food safety and the obvious things that they need to do to promote that, and that you support them in pointing out any possible food safety problems. The workers are also required to take measures not to harvest contaminated produce, and that would be either that you had identified prior to the harvest or that they identify that you hadn't previously seen, but they see it as they're about to harvest. And of course, the most important thing always is washing hands. Often but particularly after handling animals, animal feces, and any time that hands might have been contaminated. It's usually a critical component of worker training is about proper hand washing techniques. Key thing also is that workers understand that anytime they have food safety concerns, they should report it to a supervisor, and that they will be supported in pointing that out because there's an overall culture of food safety. Record keeping is required to demonstrate that your employees have been trained. It's also the only way you're going to be able to demonstrate that you were thoughtful and deliberate in following the produce safety rules, in doing your pre-planting assessment, in monitoring for animal activity, and in taking actions to reduce risks related to the animal intrusion, particularly immediately prior to harvest, looking and taking an assessment, and then any corrective actions that you would take if you observed any evidence of intrusion and contamination. You can do all that and not take any notes and not take any pictures and not write it down, and then it's pretty hard to convince someone you did it. But if you just, the picture here just shows simple little field notes, just a notebook you keep in your pocket, and you just take a note of what you did and the date and the time. The other obvious thing to do is use your telephone and take pictures of what you're doing, and those go along with the notes. This is just an example of a simple log. We'll be coming up with a series of logs like this that you can access that will just help you keep simple records of the kinds of things you're doing. You can see this is not super fancy. It's just basic notes of what you did and when you did it and who did it. So in summary, what we've covered are the stuff you knew already. Feces and urine from domesticated and wild animals can contaminate produce fields and water sources. What's new is just the deliberate plan to address that as a possible risk. The deliberate plan part is conduct pre-planting and pre-harvest assessments, have a plan for managing risk, but it doesn't mean that the presence of animals in the environment automatically contaminates the produce. It means you have a plan to assess the risk. If animal intrusion does occur, then you need to monitor the field for evidence of contamination. If you find evidence of contamination or evidence of intrusion, you need to take some steps to reduce the risk. There are many techniques for co-management to balance food safety and conservation goals, and there are plenty of people who can help you with those, including tribal officials with the Tribal Departments of Natural Resources and the U.S. Department of Agricultural Natural Resource Conservation Service, and others that work on these co-management strategies for food safety and wildlife. And then on a documentation side, you want to come up with a strategy within your farm to document that you're doing this. Most of you are probably already doing most of these things. You're just not doing them in a way that is documented and follows this sort of outline or framing of how to do it. So the biggest change will just be adopting this record keeping strategy so that you know that you're in compliance. I think this concludes with our last slide. So thank you all for attending. Like I said, there's other resources out there to help you implement this. And if you come to the official produce safety training, you'll get additional training on this topic. We have time now to take questions if anyone has any questions.
All right. Thank you, Poppy. While people are thinking about possible questions they may have, I'll give them a reminder that the best way to ask a question is to use the questions feature in the dialogue in your control panel. I'm sorry. You can just type a question in, and we'll read it out, and we'll answer your question to the best of our ability. The slide that you have in front of you now shows a link to our website. I would encourage everyone to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety. At that website, you'll find a link to all the remaining webinars in this series. You'll also find a listing of our upcoming in-person produce grower trainings, and also many other resources that have to do with food safety. So I would encourage everyone to visit that website, and there's a lot of information there. I'm not seeing any questions coming through. Poppy, did you have any closing ideas?
Nope. I hope this has been positive and that you don't think this rule is going to be particularly difficult to implement.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and seeing no further questions, we will end today's webinar. We'll see you hopefully at our next webinar, which will be next month. And until then, have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.